This is Hasty Miller. Tell me your full name.
My full name is Warren Hastings Miller, Jr.
All right.
As a junior, Warren was already taken. I could have been Warren Jr. or various things, but I was Hastings, which became Hasty probably in the second week, and I've never given it up.
I think that's a great name. Everybody, when you say Hasty Miller, they know exactly who we're talking about.
When I'm sitting...
Okay, well said.
You want us to start?
Go ahead. No, you have to start all over. Just pick up where you were.
Okay, so when you came down here, you were 6 years old, and your dad came here because?
Because he had just had prostate cancer and successful operation at Mass General Hospital, but the doctor says, you're not going to survive another Massachusetts winter. You need to move down where it's warm. And the folks said, well, we really liked Melbourne. We enjoyed it on our honeymoon. Let's move to Melbourne. Dad was an author, and he'd written, that is, had published 32 books, and so he could live wherever he wanted to, and so they moved down here. But importantly, they really liked the fine arts scene, if you will, in Gloucester, Massachusetts. It's an art colony, both painters and musicians. It's where half the Boston Pops live summer times and so forth, and they really didn't want to leave that. So they came down here for winters and then spent the summer still in Gloucester. So until I was 14, when I was 14 years old was the last year I lived in Gloucester. But I lived in both places, so I sort of compare the two.
And how did they compare?
Kind of remarkable. Gloucester is a small city, probably 25,000 people, but it was, let's see, it was settled in 1623. Okay, 2 years after the Pilgrims.
Right.
Okay, and so they had a totally developed infrastructure with schools and buses and just all the stuff that cities have. And Melbourne, the whole South Brevard area had about 6,000 people in it. Right. And there was nothing here, but there was a beach, and the beach is neat. And there were plenty of woods, and there were plenty of friends to roam around the woods with and so forth. So for me, I had a great time. But,
how did your mother do?
Mom didn't do real well because she didn't have very many people who were sort of her intellectual equals to talk with. And one of those people that she really liked and had spent a lot of time with was Bill Butter's wife, Mimi, who was a retired school teacher, and they got along really well. And
Bill Butter was the school bus driver.
Now, Bill Butter was your school bus driver,
Well, I will
but
now admit I'm 3 years older than you are. Bill Butter was Mr. Butter was and he lived right down the road from us in Indialantic.
Yes, and right down the road, the same distance down the road. You know, we lived on parallel roads. You're on 4th, I'm on 3rd.
Right.
And so, among other things, Mr. Butter used to go to the early service at Holy Trinity, and when I had to serve as an altar boy at the early service, I'd ride over with him in his 37 Ford.
Mr. Butter was just my favorite man in the whole world, and his little son, Benny Butter. Now tell me, your dad, I remember, sang in the choir.
Oh, absolutely. And so did my mother, and so did I.
With Frederica Dorset.
Yes. Yeah.
And who was the minister at that time at Holy Trinity?
Well, let's just say which time. When we first moved, it was Father Granger.
Right.
And
his mother, Mrs. Krug.
Who taught Sunday school, who was a dragon.
Snapped your hands if you even talked.
Oh, yes. And he was replaced around 1950 by George Wyatt.
Right.
And George Wyatt's specialty was bringing churches from mission, to parish status, that is self-supporting status. Right. And he accomplished that with Holy Trinity, and in 1952, I guess it was, he said, okay, I've done all I need to do, my job here is finished, and so we called Alec Boyer, who was, of course, the priest there forever after that, and Alec Boyer was the person that I was acolyte to, all the time I was acolyte.
And the whole time, Frederica Dorset was the organist.
And on years and years and years after I left to go to college and moved out. You know, Rika was Dr. Dorset's daughter, and Dr. Dorset was priest for Holy Trinity, vicar at St. John's from 1921 or something on that order, up through about the end of World War II, somewhere around
And they
there.
lived in Indialantic.
Yeah, right at the end of 3rd Avenue.
Right at the end of 3rd Avenue.
Now, I never knew Dr. Dorset. I think he had died just before we moved down, but that's where Rika and sometimes her sister lived. Carrie, yes.
Lived there.
Yeah.
Right. But they lived in Indialantic, and in fact, they were a block and a half away, and when I was 4, I walked to their house every morning, and Aunt Frederica would give me a piano lesson.
I was going to say, you must have taken piano lessons
I
from
did.
her.
So that's what started that. But, okay, and you started in the 2nd grade here. What did you, do you remember any of your memories of 2nd grade when you went to, tell us where 2nd grade was at the time you came.
Okay, the place that is now the Ruth Henniger Center for the Performing Arts was the school for South Brevard for many, many years, and the middle building of that was the elementary school, so that's where 2nd grade was, 1st through 6th. Right. And I was one of those kids that I could have either been a half a year too old or a half a year too young for my grade, since my birthday's in January. And my mother decided it was better if I was too young, so I started in 2nd grade instead of starting in 1st grade. But it could have gone either way. But I could read and write by that time, so I could do the work. But I hadn't been there very long before I got flu pneumonia, and I was in bed for like 6 weeks straight. So I didn't spend a whole lot of time in 2nd grade.
You didn't go to the hospital, though.
No, I was treated at home by Dr. Hay, I believe.
Right.
And I remember he was treating me with penicillin, and I would scream every time I'd get a penicillin shot. It's just a horrible thing to do to a poor little boy.
It is, but it was Dr. Hay was probably the doctor that I remember.
He was the only doctor, I think.
I didn't know if Dr. Hicks was here then or Dr. Balch, but I remember Dr. Hay because that's where we all went.
But very shortly, Dr. Kaminsky moved into town, and then shortly Dr. Gaydon, John Gaydon, came in to be his partner.
Right.
And those were our doctors for a lot of years.
And that's when we were getting to be a bigger town. Do you remember where you did your grocery shopping? Where your parents did the grocery shopping?
Before Wynn Lovett's opened up, I don't know. Okay. But Wynn Lovett's opened up in what's now Meehan's. Right. And it became, the Lovett got bought out by Dixie, it became Winn-Dixie. Oh, but it was Wynn Lovett's at that time.
All right. Now, tell me about what your parents thought when they were living here, other than the fact that it was probably very bare in terms of community things like symphonies or orchestras or any kind of musical.
That was the bad part. The good part was that both Mom and Dad loved the outdoors. Dad was a nationally famous outdoorsman, wrote a number of books on how to do it in the outdoors. And they loved fishing. They were probably 2 or 3 days a week down surf fishing in the ocean. They just liked the climate. And, I remember you were talking with Dan just a little while ago, and how the DDT trucks used to come by. And I don't remember the trucks as much as I remembered the biplane clearing the roof by about 5 feet each time.
And waking you up early in the morning.
Oh, absolutely, dynamiting you right out of bed.
Now, the fish, when they fished on the, right up here.
Yeah, bluefish and whiting.
Bluefish during the season, when they were running, and whiting. What about pompano?
Very seldom pompano. It's just one of those great days. One of the reasons that they fished was because that's the way you ate.
Right.
And it was just a wonderful day if you caught a pompano, but they were rare.
Right.
Channel bass, not so rare. We not infrequently catch channel bass.
Now, they fish the sand fleas?
Yeah, sand fleas and cut bait.
Right.
You know, the first little fish you catch, you cut it up.
Yeah.
You know.
Because I remember hearing that the pompano would bite the sand fleas, so I remember trying to do that. And what else did you do at the ocean? Can you remember what other, did you all go down there and cook out, or?
Didn't cook out that I remember, but I remember that when we went to the beach, a lot of the fun was playing in the pool outfall from the Bahama Beach Club, which, if you remember, it cut a creek all the way down to the ocean.
It did.
And that creek there was a fun place to play if you didn't want to go out into the surf.
And there was lots of coquina rock, huge pieces of coquina rock. Do you remember that? on the beach? Because I do, because I picked it up. It's the thing. But the rock, the whole, it was so different.
Yeah, but there, particularly up at the end of the O'Galley Causeway, there's a lot of rock exposed now that was not exposed then. And even in Melbourne sometimes, these days, you can trip over sunken ledges of coquina rock.
Right.
Never had that at all. There was a lot more beach in those days than there is now. It's washed out a lot.
Yeah, you remember the little tiny pools that the beach left as it went out? We could,
Sure.
You know, it was so. It
Yeah.
was quite a
Yeah.
different world then, wasn't it? Now, what did you ever eat the coquinas?
Oh, absolutely. Coquina broth is
Talk about
really good.
that.
Yeah.
Talk about it.
Well, you know, you as the wave recedes, the coquinas are left on top of the sand, and you can pick them out because they're digging rapidly to get under the sand. And so anything that moves, you pick out.
Right.
And we'd go around with an empty can or something and fill them up with coquina, and then my mother would boil them, and it would make a really good soup.
My father assured me that this would make me much healthier. And now,
Don't know about that, but it was good.
It was good. Tell me about Indialantic. Did you play? What happened? What kind of childhood did you have in Indialantic?
Well, you know, we played like kids usually do, you know, cops and robbers and cowboys and Indians and those sort of things. But a rather interesting thing to me, thinking back on it, was some of the peculiarities of the roads. You remember when Indialantic was platted? It was platted with 50-foot lots. Everything, you know, it was bulldozed flat from border to border. And then a palm tree was planted at the corner of each, a coconut palm planted at the corner of each lot, and 2 oleanders planted between each coconut tree, all the way, all the lots over the entire island. Some of the roads, though, weren't paved. And between your house and mine, that is between on Shannon Avenue, between 4th and 3rd, and between 3rd and 2nd, it was total sugar sand dirt. So if you were going to, for example, Jack and Kay Gordon's house, who lived on 2nd, just a little bit west of A1A, your natural tendency would be to come across the causeway, come down 5th Avenue, turn north, turn left on Shannon Avenue, and all of a sudden come to this road. It was only 200 feet of sand. Of course you could make it. And that road would bury a Humvee, I'll tell you. We dug more cars out of that road.
The shifting sands of Indialantic.
Palm Avenue had been platted, but had never been built. And I don't know where it went, but from 3rd Avenue over to 4th Avenue, there was a sidewalk that was totally overgrown. You had to crawl on your hands and knees to get down that sidewalk. But it was the only sidewalk in Indialantic. No one else had a sidewalk, but the Palm Avenue that wasn't there had a sidewalk.
I can tell you why that was there, and I'd completely forgotten about it. Sue Ann's Bakery today was my mother and father's little house that my grandmother had built for them. My grandmother's house was on 5th Avenue down the road. My father had that sidewalk put in to go over to 4th Avenue because our new house was on 4th Avenue. And while it was being built, he wanted to get from our house on 5th Avenue over to 4th Avenue, and he put the sidewalk in so we could all ride bikes and get there. It was the only sidewalk in Indialantic.
Far out.
I know. That's a little known story. Okie doke. Tell me about the people. Tell me about the people your parents were friends with and what they did.
Okay, well, I had mentioned the Butters. Let me get into a little secondhand history, because Pop, or Bill Butter, was a fascinating person in his own right. And he taught me a lot of the history from long before we moved there. And I realize that this is secondhand, but at least a little bit of it I verified for myself. Pop moved from St. Louis in, I think, 1921 to Deer Park, and he had a potato farm out there.
That's west of Melbourne.
About 12 miles west of Melbourne.
Right.
And the potato farm lasted a while. There was no road. He used to ride a mule into Melbourne for Saturday night or whatever. And then he went to work for Union Cypress, Mr. Hopkins Lumber Company.
Right.
And he managed the commissary for Union Cypress.
Was that in Fellsmere?
The commissary was at, first off, the Union Cypress was South Melbourne.
Right.
Okay, it was just south of it was on the south border of Crane Creek and just a little bit west of where the railroad tracks are. Well, railroad tracks have always been there. But commissary meant supplying all the various camp commissaries at the cypress, the timber cutting camps, all up and down the railroad. And so there were these little camps at various places that Mr. Hopkins' daughter named, and she would name them for Seminole Indian words for birds and flowers and so forth, like Holapaw, Yeehaw, and places like that. Some of them don't exist anymore. But he used to ride the railroad and supply all of these commissary shacks, whatever, that were at the timber cutting camps.
That's fascinating.
That's how Holapaw got its name. Mr. Hopkins' daughter named it.
For an Indian word.
Now, and then later on, he was head of civilian personnel. That is the what do you call it? The human resources.
Right.
He was human resources
we didn't
for
use that word in those days.
Indeed, it was just personnel. But I'm trying to get it.
Mr. Butter that you're talking
This is
about?
Mr. Butter was the head of human resources for civilian personnel for Melbourne Naval Air Station. Back in the days when they were training, everybody who flew F-6s in the Pacific learned to fly in Melbourne.
Right.
Learned to fly that plane in Melbourne.
What is now Patrick Air Force Base.
No,
Oh, you're
Melbourne
talking about the
Naval Air
Melbourne
Station.
Naval Air
Melbourne
Station.
Naval Air
That's
Station,
where
not
Andy
Banana.
Anderson was the commanding officer there.
Okay.
But
Okay.
it's where the Melbourne Airport is now.
Yes, indeed.
And that's why the runway is so long, was because they were training pilots on that runway.
Part of the reason. I got another part of the reason.
Go for it.
Okay. Now, Bill Butter used to tell stories about, the war was on full rush, and they were building planes as fast as they could, and they were training pilots as fast as they could, and pilots made mistakes, and airplanes came apart, and pilots died. It was just part of training. But the instructors were, they had to maintain the image as the top gun. And one of the things the instructors would do to prove their superiority was to fly the airplane through the hangar. This is a 300-mile-an-hour airplane. And one day, one of the instructors pulled up, saw that the door was open in the hangar, came down and leveled out right at the door. And then he discovered the far door was not open. And everything that would fit behind a radial engine made it through the far door. And this was very important because that hangar was all yellow pine, and it would have gone up like the biggest torch in the world, but the gas tanks made it out through the hole left by the radial engine. Unfortunately, the pilot's head and shoulders don't fit behind a radial engine. I was a Civil Air Patrol cadet long after the base had been deactivated, and we drilled in that hangar. And I remembered, after I'd been there a while, I remembered Bill's story about flying the plane through the door, and I looked up on the door, and about 10 feet above the ground was about an 8-foot diameter patch in the door. So I'm pretty sure that's a real story, that really happened.
Now that was at the Melbourne Airport. Where
That was at what's now Melbourne Airport.
Right.
Now, one reason that the runway is so long was because Boeing, one of the earliest missiles that they launched at the Cape was the Boeing Beaumark, which was a pilotless interceptor. It was designed to intercept enemy bombers coming in. And Boeing had a big presence there at the Cape, and Boeing had the 707. And they wanted to have a straight flight from Melbourne to Seattle, so they lengthened the Melbourne runway to 10,000 feet where it would handle the 707. Melbourne was the first jet port in Florida.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, Melbourne had an airport before it became Melbourne Naval Air Station, but they did indeed lengthen the runways a lot to make it Melbourne Air Station. But then when the Cold War started, and in the mid-50s when they were testing the Beaumark, that's when they expanded the runway to, and of course that was the coming thing. Jet travel was going to be obviously the thing.
Tell me a little bit about, we were talking about this earlier, tell me about what you remember with the missiles. What impact they had on the lives of us that lived in Indialantic?
Well, for the first 5 years, basically, up through 1949. Melbourne was Melbourne. It was just a little town. And then all of a sudden, these Army olive drab cars with JLRPG license plates started showing up and driving around. We soon found out that meant Joint Long-Range Proving Grounds, because armies don't have missile test ranges, they have proving grounds where they shoot guns. And then the Air Force stopped becoming the Army Air Force and became the U.S. Air Force. And what had been Banana River Naval Air Station became Patrick Air Force Base, and they started launching the first of the guided missiles, which were in the beginning of the Cold War. And those missiles, the first one was the Martin Matador, which was a jet-powered, single-engined flying bomb. It was really a big German V-1. Now, they would be very insulted to hear me say that, but it was, if you took the basic concept of a V1 and powered it with a turbojet engine, that's what you had. It was made by Martin. And Dennis Keeney all of a sudden showed up in our school, and his father worked for Martin and they had just moved from White Sands, and he was a missile technician. I think he was an engineer, and he had moved to develop the Martin Matador. And all of a sudden, here is somebody whose father is an engineer. He's a technical person, and everybody had either been a cowpuncher or a store clerk or a store owner in Melbourne. And this was all really different. And then all of a sudden, a whole lot of people started coming in. And that was just about the time that I left for college, which was September 1956. I went up to Atlanta to Georgia Tech. And I'd been there a few quarters. And when I started, before I started, my mother was town clerk of Indialantic. And one of the town councilmen was Keith McDaniel. And Keith McDaniel's day job was he was the manager of the Boeing test operation. And Mom knew that there was no way she and Dad could afford to put me through Georgia Tech. I'd have to go through on my own, and I needed a way of doing that. And she'd heard about the co-op plan, and that Georgia Tech had a co-op plan where you went to school for 3 months and then you worked for 3 months. So she asked Keith, who is hiring co-op students? And he says, what are co-op students? So she explained, and he said, I don't know, I'll look into it. Well, he ended up hiring 2 of us from Georgia Tech and 2 of us from Auburn. And I would be on the job for a quarter, and my opposite number, I would leave on Friday, and my opposite number would be there on Monday. And then I'd be going to school, and then he'd leave on Friday, and I'd be there on Monday. So there was this position called first quarter co-op or freshman co-op or whatever that just was manned by this constantly rotating series of young people. And the same thing, not necessarily from Georgia Tech, they could have been from Auburn or whoever. So I started at the Cape in January 1957. And I was working on the Beaumark, and I never saw either a Snark or a Matador launch, but by that time they were starting to launch Atlases and Titans. And Atlas 1, I wasn't at work when they launched that. It happened to be a Saturday, and I happened to be up on the roof of the Bahama Beach Club with Don McGinley. And Don says, there goes one of the missiles, and I looked, and there it went. And there it went end over end and a big bang, and it came showering down like confetti, some of that confetti being 3,000-pound engines, but still. And Bunks McGinley was the manager of the Bahama Beach Club, which was why we were up on the sun deck on the Bahama Beach Club. Yes, indeed.
And don't you remember we all kept thinking, what will happen if someone...
Where the guidance didn't work so well, the Polaris was classic on that. And one of the Polarises went into the Banana River just offshore of a trailer park.
Right.
It could have gone into the trailer park just as well. You know,
and
there was a lot of
discussion. So lucky to be here watching all this.
Oh yeah.
Tell me about the interesting people.
Well, hang on just a second before we get off. Before we get off of the missiles, This was the Cold War. These were war rockets. They were all highly classified, and the less people knew about what was going on at the Cape, the better. So we at the Cape, the countdowns, there were countdowns for everything, every kind of test. It might have just been a range sound system test, but they would have the test number 1464. It is T minus 623 minutes on test number 1464. Now, you might happen to know, if you were in the know, that test number 1464 was an Atlas, and they were going to launch it this time. And you might want to call your wife and say, dear, you know, it's just a beautiful day. It might be rainy out, but it's just a beautiful day. You might think about taking the kids to the beach at around 11:52. And sure enough, if you look at any of the launches all along the beach, there are people standing, totally classified. Nobody knew what time anything was going to launch, but they all showed up just about the time of the launch.
Or pulled off on the causeway.
Pulled off on the causeway. Yep, yep.
All right.
Now go back to.
Well, what I was going to ask you about is, tell me about some of, and cover a span of years on this. What were some of the very interesting people that you remember coming to Melbourne? You've been here to remember lots of them, and why?
Well, okay, one of them that was specifically interesting to me as I was approximately a sophomore in college. You remember the Trade Winds Club, which was, you know, you had mentioned, I heard you earlier saying that your wedding reception was held at the pool. And the Trade Winds Club had very economical pool memberships because it was not very busy in the, let's say, 58, 59 time frame. And so I had a pool membership. It's also where the Melbourne High School swim team used to train, and I was on the Melbourne High swim team before that. But by this time, I was a sophomore in college, and I'd come down and I was swimming, and there was this gorgeous, gorgeous girl was swimming too. So, of course, I swam up alongside, said, hi, I'm Hasty Miller, and she said, oh, nice to meet you, I'm Uta Debus, and she had this most beautiful Southern accent. And she,
Southern?
Very Southern accent. She was raised in Texas. Okay.
I would have thought you'd have a German accent.
She was raised in Texas because her father was Dr. Kurt Debus, who ran the space program, who was one of the Peenemünde rocket scientists that they had, the Germans had not exactly defected, but when surrender was obvious, they marched quickly to the American side so they wouldn't have to surrender to the Russians. But anyway, we made really sure that we took care of our German rocket scientists and put them all in a moderately comfortable concentration camp in Texas. So for a year or two, until they got all the political stuff straightened out and got them papers and so forth, they lived in Texas, and that's where Uta had grown up. And so she had this beautiful honey child Texas accent, and she took me over and she said, and this is my father Kurt, and this is my mother, I don't remember her name. And they were almost unintelligible. They had the thickest German accents.
Right. Well, that's right. Name us some more. That's fascinating.
The whole social dynamic of Melbourne High School changed during that time, aside from the fact that it grew at an absolutely remarkable rate. One of the things that happened was that my mother and a number of other people formed a committee. Mrs. Fenner was one of them. I think Mrs. Jacobus was one of them. But they formed a committee to investigate the school. And they really didn't like what they found. About half the teachers were unqualified, and the door to the physics lab hadn't been unlocked in 2 years, and on and on and on. And they hired this young a guy with a master's degree from Georgia named B. Frank Brown, who got his doctorate shortly after that and became one of the world's great principals.
Certainly it was. I mean, it took Melbourne to the top in terms of high schools and stuff.
It was the top-ranking high school in the United States, with the exception of one that was a pilot project for Northwestern University. So for a little cow town, we were doing pretty well.
And you know, it's interesting, he went on to become an incredible Croton expert and is well known all around the world.
Certainly. certainly.
expertise in that.
And he was doing a lot of that. After he'd gotten the school straightened out and running on a sort of an even keel, he sort of quit being principal and sort of became gardener at the school for quite a while. But
He
that was after my time.
And he still is.
Running.
We are wrong.
Right, so we ended up with Frank Brown. And
We ended up with Frank Brown, and one of the things that he said to the citizenry at one time, he was giving a local speech, and he said, "We are growing our school is growing at the rate of 30 students a week." Now, what I just said was we are growing at the rate of one classroom needs to be built every week to keep up with the growth in this school. And those people who were coming in, a lot of them were people with whose parents had a technical background. And so all of a sudden we had three kinds of people. We had three cliques of people at the school. And I was very conscious of this just a few years ago because I was putting on the 50th reunion for the class of '56. And I wanted to make sure I had people on my committee representing the Cowboys, people on my committee representing the downtown kids, and people on my committee representing the techs, so that they would know where somebody had gone, because that's the hardest part on a reunion, is to round up everybody, get back in contact with everybody. But that's what we had. We had these three different groups of people in the school. And the people who were the downtown people, their parents and their grandparents had grown up here, like your folks. And the Cowboys, well, Toby's umpty great-grandfather homesteaded Melbourne in 1820, which is during the first Seminole War.
Right.
So they went way, way back, and they had their own technology, or their own culture. But the techs came from everywhere in the United States and had no background here. They had all just moved in, which kind of gets me to another major thing, that the difference between Melbourne as a small town and Melbourne as a boom town around, let's say, 1960, was all these people who had been shipped in to launch Atlases or launch Titans or launch Beaumarks or whatever, were typically on a 3 or 4 year assignment. It doesn't take that long to get the bugs worked out. I mean, first you got to build a pad, and then you got to launch missiles, and then you got to figure out why they didn't work in the first place. And then eventually you get them where they're operational and you're done. So that was like a 3-year program. And people were coming from all these big cities like Los Angeles and Baltimore and places like that. And they were coming down here, and they were literally drawing what they called swamp pay. They gave them extra money because they were away from all these city amenities. And they were away from their support groups and the people that had raised them when they were kids and the people who told their mothers when they were doing bad things. And they didn't have anything to do around here except drink and swap wives. And they were not voting for school bonds and civic improvements and that sort of thing. And this was the biggest tent city you ever saw.
It was, and it was well known. I mean, unfortunately for our community, it became... Life magazine, I think, wrote a whole thing about, not particularly the South part of Brevard, but they hit Cocoa Beach and stuff because the whole lifestyle was different. People didn't know who their next door neighbors were, so you could behave with...
So you could do anything you wanted, and who was going to complain?
Nobody would know.
Sure.
So the world changed for those of us in Melbourne.
That was up to about 1960, because if you remember, there was nothing in Cocoa Beach. Cocoa Beach was a row of little summer houses, or winter houses, I guess,
had been built,
on the sand dunes.
And those houses had all been built to house the military people during World War II.
Okay.
Most of those little houses were built there for the military people.
But if most of the work for the first few years was not done at the Cape because there was nothing at the Cape, but there were a lot of buildings, including a large machine shop there at what became Patrick Air Force Base. And so people would work on the missiles there at Patrick, and then they'd ship them by trailer, and everybody would sort of run off into the palmettos and hold their ears and launch them. And then they gradually built up a whole infrastructure up at the Cape, and then everything was built at the Cape and launched at the Cape. And meanwhile, Cocoa Beach, they dredged and filled for thousands and thousands of houses. And the people who were working at the Cape more and more lived at Cocoa Beach, Cocoa, Titusville, Merritt Island, places like that. But at the same time, in around 1950, these young engineers from Melpar in Baltimore, or in Washington, D.C., moved down and formed a company called Radiation Incorporated. Radiation being electromagnetic radiation, they were tracking missiles and building telemetry. And another group moved down and formed a company called Sorabon, which is one of the first companies that built computer peripherals, data handling stuff. And from those two companies, all the other companies that spun off came. And then big companies like Grumman started to recognize there is a pool of talented technical people who are not associated with the Cape. We need to build a division down here. So the south part of the county became very stable, that these were people who were not going to move away and so forth. And we became kind of civilized down here. But there was a while when it was really a tent city.
I remember those days well. Tell me a little bit about, we all talk about this warming trend, and you've lived here now all these years, right in this little area. What do you see different in the climate in Indialantic? Other than, let me just digress quickly. I remember, and I'm sure you do too, the beautiful little soft little showers we had every single afternoon in the summers.
I remember April's, for example, where for the half an hour that I'd get off the school bus, it would rain. I mean, every afternoon, like from 4 to 4:30, it would rain.
Right.
But
no thunder, no lightning,
just rain, nice little shower.
Right.
It's hard for me to say how much, whether the climate has really changed all that much. The climate has always really had ups and downs. In 1895, all of Melbourne Beach, for example, was pineapple farms. That was the big crop in Melbourne Beach. 1895, December of 1895, there was a freeze that put 3 feet of snow in Kissimmee.
Oh my golly.
It was utterly unbelievable. Froze out every pineapple, and they hadn't been there all that long, and they decided this was really dumb raising pineapples in Florida, so they quit. Now, when Mr. Callenhoven platted Indialantic, I think I mentioned that he put coconut palms, this would be 1921, round figures, he put coconut palms every 50 feet along every road in Indialantic. So by the time I was growing up, we had 2 magnificent coconut palms in our yard. They were gorgeous. They were 40 feet high, 50 feet high, something. They were full, mature coconut palms. The December of 1964, we had a freeze that lasted about 4 days, and it killed off every coconut palm in Indialantic. It was like 750.
I don't think anybody will, 750 coconut palms.
I think that's right.
I do not think anybody will ever forget. It was at Christmas time, that cold 4 days. It was just...
But obviously it was the first freeze of that magnitude since those trees had been planted, because they are really tropical trees.
Right.
For many years, Vero used to call itself the start of the tropics.
And do they still do that? I was wondering.
No, I really don't know. But that was as far north as royal palms would grow, except there was a huge royal palm at the south gate of the Cape Canaveral. Okay, you went past that royal palm every morning going to work, except that 1965 or 64, it was gone. You know, that freeze took it out.
Sad?
And then we can fast forward a number of years to February of 1996, which I happen to remember because I was cruising south to pick up Don McGinley in Miami, and we were going on a cruise. And I was riding a cold front south, and I anchored in West Palm Beach, and it got to 22 degrees that night in West Palm Beach. So we've had some fairly brisk temperatures recently, but you'd never know it from this last winter. I think I could have worn what I'm wearing now any day we've had this winter. It's been beautiful.
It's very interesting, isn't it?
Oh, and one other thing. 1960, I took my bride to be, I took my bride. This was December 1960. I just married Julie, and we came down here on our honeymoon. And for the 2 weeks we were down here, the weather was just like this. And she thought, wow, this is a great place to be. It never gets cold here.
You didn't tell her any differently,
Oh, of
did
course
you?
not.
Tell me, just think for a second, thinking back to when you first came here in the second grade, what growth in Indialantic have you seen the most? What do you think the greatest change in Indialantic, other than let's not talk about the population, but the lifestyle in Indialantic, what is the biggest difference?
Indialantic, to some degree, has mirrored what's happened in middle income people. That when you were growing up, and when I was growing up, the people who lived in Indialantic were classic middle-income folks, and they all lived in 2-bedroom, 1-bath houses, and there were a few fairly wealthy people like the Haywards and the Abbotts and the Luxes who had built nice houses, which was like a 3 and 2. And of course, these days, aside from the fact that there are very few vacant lots in Indialantic, which is a huge difference because there were, 80 houses or something like that when we were growing up, and now there are 1,000. But now there are, the average house is more like a 4 and 4, and then there are plenty of McMansions around.
Right. And the roads are paved.
Yeah,
for the most part.
I remember that is one of the principal reasons that we became Indialantic, because Indialantic as a city could then pass bonds to get their roads paved. That was the first thing that we did, other than buying a 1953 Plymouth as a police car. But that was the first thing we did as a town, was to get the roads paved.
With a great deal of trouble too, by the way.
Oh yeah, that was trouble, meaning an awful lot of volunteers put in an awful lot of volunteer labor to come up with the assessments and convince people that it was a worthwhile thing to do, and that they really had to spend that money and all of that. It was a real team effort on the people who were the original residents of Indialantic.
And now we're a thoroughfare.
And yeah, now we're a thoroughfare. But I can't separate Indialantic, the growth of Indialantic, out from the growth of the county as a whole. But let me give you a couple of things to think about. One is, I brought this little show and tell here, which this was a reproduction of the school newspaper, and it was just given to me a week or so ago by Ray McClendon from class of '55. Oh, okay. And the two things that are interesting about it: this was, the class 55 was the last class to graduate from this high school, which you're not looking at, yeah, I guess,
Henniger.
yeah. You're looking at the high school building. The Henniger, the elementary school building, is right here. There were 3 buildings in line, and one of them's gone completely. But this building is right across the street from the current post office, and it's right at the end of where all the little boutique shops in downtown Old Melbourne are.
And we all went. Everybody in the outlying districts went to that
Everybody
school.
from south of Rockledge went to that school.
And down to the
And down to the Indian River County line.
and the beach, and then west.
And our alma mater at the time was on our city's western border, reared against the sky, stands our noble alma mater, dear old Melbourne High. And if you went 1 block west of that school, you were in the woods.
We used to think, how far it was when you went out to where Babcock is. I mean, Babcock wasn't there.
Right. It was way out.
Now let's talk about
So,
the bridge for a minute.
hang on.
Oh,
So,
I want to get to the bridge.
that old bridge.
Go on.
So I would get on the school bus, and most of the time, interestingly for me as a technologist, the school bus then looked just like the school buses of today. The yellow school buses haven't changed all that much.
That's the only thing that hasn't changed.
All the grades who were going to that school, all 12 grades, would get on that school bus, we would drive up. This wasn't all the kids who went to school, but this particular school bus handled all the kids who went to the bluff. We went up to the bluff, and then back down, and then across that bridge, which was Cowenhoven's rattly wooden bridge, and across to Indialantic, and up to the O'Galley Causeway, and back down to Honest John's Fish Camp, which is down in Floridana Beach today. Still, Honest John's Fish Camp is still there, because part of the time the bus driver was Mrs. Honest John. And so that entire area of Melbourne, Melbourne Beach, Indialantic, north of Indialantic, and the Bluff, all the kids were on that one bus.
For how long?
Probably an hour and a half, 2 hours. That area now is served by, what, 6 or 7 schools that have 100 buses each?
Easily.
You know, and that's what growth has meant. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the bridge.
Well, because you saw all the changes. That's what I want you to talk about, the changes in the bridge.
Okay. First off, in around 1935 or so, they decided that the bridge was getting really old and creaky, and the bridge went from shore to shore. And a better way of doing it, now that drag lines had been improved and so forth, was to dredge causeways and then connect from the shore to the first causeway, and from the first causeway over a big bridge to the second causeway, and from the second causeway over a little bridge to the mainland shore. And they got the causeways in and they got the little bridges in, but World War II intervened before they could replace the drawbridge. So all this time from 1945 on to 1949, I think it was, that we went over this bridge that had been put in 1921, and it was a rattly old bridge. And the particular concern that I had was that I was, until when I was 12 years old, I couldn't swim. And this is a horrible thing, considering all the stuff that I was doing on the water and all the rambling around and so forth. And you could look out the window of that school bus, and the school bus was so close to the guardrail you couldn't see the guardrail. All you could see was water down there.
So you were the only child on the school bus with a life jacket on.
Oh, heck no.
I
None
know.
of us had life jackets.
I know.
But I was scared going across that bridge. So I was so thankful when they put in the new bridge. Well, another person who rode the bus with me 2 years later than me in school was Don McGinley. Don McGinley comes into it many years later because we rode the bus over that nice new concrete bridge. The old bridge had a draw that was electrical sometime, and it was hand powered a good part of the time. And so when a boat went through and the electricity was out, then this guy would put a lever in the middle of the bridge and walk around and around and around and around, and then it took a while to get a boat through.
Was that during the time when the boats had to honk 3 times for the bridge to open?
Oh yes, yeah.
There weren't set times.
And I, in later years, I was one of those boats who had to honk 3 times to get through that bridge, and I learned a lot about waiting on that bridge from the boat's side. But it was, let's see, about 1990, and I was building my current boat in my backyard, and Don McGinley and I had been friends for many, many years, and he'd moved away when he went to college, and he'd lived in many, many places, and he happened to come back for the first time in many years and was just dropped by my house to see what was going on, and he knew about the boat and so forth, but I wasn't there. I was off running an errand. So he went over to Indialantic, where he grew up. I mean, you mentioned that his father was the manager first of the Bahama Beach Club and then of the Trade Winds Club. Right. So we did quite a bit of rambling around where we weren't supposed to be in those places. And so he went over, and in 1990, to get to Indialantic, he went over the high-rise bridge. And so he came back after an hour, and I was there working on the boat, and the first thing he said as he came walking up the steps onto the boat was, "What happened to the new bridge?" And then I explained to him, and he said, "I've outlived a bridge. I remember when we built the new bridge, and it's gone. I've outlived a bridge."
That's true. We only built one high-rise at a time.
Yes, yeah. Built,
and so you came back. You came from west to east on the new high rise, but from east to west on the causeways and the rickety rackety.
Yeah. So, okay. Where do we go from there?
Well, let me ask you another question, and
Okay.
we'll start winding up. I would like you to tell me something, because you know more about Indialantic than many, many people I've talked to, and about this whole community. Tell me why you still live here.
Remember that I'm an engineer, and as such, I get shipped all over the country. And I've had an opportunity to see an awful lot of places, and sometimes for weeks at a time. And number one, I've never found a place that was just generally more pleasant to live. We have enough amenities. If you really like symphony music, you can play in the BSO. You can listen to the BSO. You can play in the BSO. And I'll guarantee you can't play in the Boston Pops, even if you really like music. It has got this wonderful year-round climate, and I really like sailing, and I really like hiking, just seeing stuff, just going out on a nature walk and so forth. And I can do that almost any day of the year. So for that reason, I'm real happy that I'm still here. But then I could say the same thing about a number of other, the next thing that I'm going to say I could say about a number of other places. I've been here almost all my life. And so the kids that I've grown up with have become the mayors and the managers. And if I've got an auto parts problem, I go to Gene Ferguson. And we had a problem in Palm Bay a few years ago where they were going to build what essentially was a sort of medium security prison right across the street from my house. And I didn't think that was very nice, and I got a hold of Harry Good, who was my state representative, and he and I went through about 10 of our 11 years together in class, and all of a sudden it went away. And my roots are pretty deep these days. I've been at the same church for many years, and in the same group of churches ever since I moved here. I've been at the yacht club for 40 years now, so the Melbourne Yacht Club, yes. And so for all those reasons, I think, first off, it's a real good thing to stay where you grew up. And John D. MacDonald made a really good point about it's not a really good thing to spend most of your life in a place and then move to Florida and move into a condominium. That's a tough thing to do. So that's why I'm still here.
Well, we're very lucky to have you, and I think there are so many people when I look around, because probably listening to you talk, your friends that you have now are the friends that know everything about you. They went to school with you, they've grown up with you. That's the way my life is.
And they still put up with me. It's just amazing.
And they love this community as much as we do.
Yes, that's very true.
Very good. So, Hasty, it has been so much fun talking to you and listening to all the fascinating stuff. You spoke not just about Indialantic, but you spoke about the whole community, which you gave me a feeling of the breadth of it all of it being so tied together. Have I left anything out? Is there something that you could tell me that I've left out?
Not really. You realize that South Brevard acts a little bit like Los Angeles, that South Brevard is not just Melbourne. I mean, these days, Palm Bay, that was 600 people when I moved here, is now substantially larger than Melbourne, where I think 109,000 currently. Right. And I say, I'm from Palm Bay, and people say, do what? No. I'm from Concord, Massachusetts. Well, everybody knows where that is, population 20,000 or something like that.
Yeah. But you know the lovely thing about all this is everything that you're talking about is within 20 minutes. Cocoa Beach is 20 minutes. Palm Bay is 20 minutes on a good day. West Melbourne, I mean, that we really are very lucky. Even for being geographically as large as we are, we still can go so many different places.
And there's enough population that they can support one unique store, one really unique dress shop, one really unique hardware store, one really unique auto parts store.
Right.
Yeah.
All those things we didn't have when you and I grew up.
Oh, that's fact.
We had McCrory's 5 and Dime on New Haven Avenue.
My orthodontist was in Orlando,
Yeah, my dentist.
commuting to Orlando. Yeah,
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
Oh, thank you so much for the opportunity, Deanne. It's been wonderful.
Great.
Okay, Deanne, there's just one more thing that we need to cover for the sake of completeness. You know, I lived at 230 3rd Avenue, which was about halfway down the length of the street between the ocean and the river. And just down the street from us and across on the other side, there lived this old couple who were somewhat eccentric, and their hobby, passion, was they were trying to raise Dalmatians that instead of having spots had rosettes like jaguars do. And he'd been a petty officer in the Spanish-American War, and my father had been a lieutenant in, he'd been an ensign in the Spanish-American War and a lieutenant in the First World War. So Carl Hodges used to call Dad Lieutenant, and Dad used to get Carl to help him anytime there was something that needed some real strength, because Carl was a very strong man, and he'd carry heavy trees and stuff like that. But the two of them were living in this house that the house had gotten so decrepit that the roof had actually fallen in. So instead of living in the house, they lived in the garage, which still had a roof over it, and 76 dogs were living in the house. And it was a real nuisance in the sense that the dogs were always barking, and these people, they didn't have any money, so they looked like homeless people, and they scared folks because they didn't understand them, and they were pretty eccentric. One time the state of Florida said, well, these folks belong in some kind of a psychiatric facility, so they didn't have any good legal reason to do that, so they administered an IQ test. And they came in something like first and second in the state of Florida. These were very bright people. They were just seriously eccentric. They were there when we moved in 1945, and I believe they were still there when I left to go to college in 1956, the fall of 1956. But the result of that was that, you know, the expression of living on the wrong side of the tracks. Well, the tracks went in a big circle all around our two houses. It was about a 1-block radius circle, and inside that circle was the wrong side of the tracks, and it's that way to this day. The imprint of those crazy people and their dogs has remained for a long, long while.